Episode 163, Pumped Hydro and a Hazelnut-driven Food System. This is the World Organic News for the week ending 8th of April 2019. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. More good news this week on the decarbonise the air part of the tagline. As ever, just because something can be done doesn't mean that it will be. So to the article from Science Alert. Huge global study just smashed one of the last major arguments against renewable. So that's all good then. Quote, we just got massive news in the ongoing drive to switch to renewable energy. Scientists have identified 530,000 sites worldwide suitable for pumped hydro energy storage, capable of storing more than enough energy to power the entire planet. Pumped hydro is one of the best technologies we have for storing intermittent renewable energy such as solar power, which means these sites could act as giant batteries, helping to support cheap, fully renewable solar grids. As of now, the sites have only been identified by an algorithm, so further on-the-ground research needs to be done. But it was previously assumed there were only limited of suitable sites around the world, and that we wouldn't be able to store enough renewable energy for high-demand times, which this study shows isn't the case at all, end quote. Pumped hydro has been a theme for some time on this podcast. As I've stated elsewhere, it is based on tried and true tested technologies. The mechanics of hydropower generation are well known. Running the generators backwards, or perhaps in reverse would be more accurate, turns them into pumps. So when the intermittent energy, generation of solar, wind, wave or whatever else turns up in the future, the excess produced over that consumed is used to pump water uphill, and here it sits until the demand for power results in the water flowing back downhill, turning the turbines and generating electricity. Earlier episodes discussed the availability of such sites in Australia. This piece of research shows the globe is covered with appropriate sites. So we have the knowledge, the technical ability, but do we have the political will? Given the National Party in Queensland here in Australia is pushing for, of all things, a coal-fired power station before the next election, we can only hope this will be the last of these sorts of election follies. Now we move to the aspect of the second part of the tagline. From the blog Deep Agroecology comes the post, The Marvellous Million Hazelnut Campaign. Quote, imagine the vast GMO glyphosate soybean fields of America's heartland transformed into a perennial forest with swarms of hazelnut trees, deeply rooted and thick as lilac bushes, 14 feet tall and heavily laden with oil-rich nuts, which have 101 uses. Imagine the annual harvest of hazelnuts fulfilling a cornucopia of needs. Animal feed, for cooking oil, for fuel, for human food, and for many of the purposes and functions now filled by soy. How different the landscape, how changed the land itself, and all the creatures which share life upon that land. How profoundly different the environmental impact, end quote. This particular food source is something I'd looked into in another life about 15 years ago. The research then was fascinating. For some reason, the humble hazelnut popped into my mind earlier this week, and then this article arrived in my field of vision. Now, these nuts are truly amazing and highly undervalued. I read somewhere this week that half of the world's production is used by Nutella and their imitators, but there is so much more we can do with hazelnuts. Nuts produce about 1,000 kilograms per acre. If we take half of this as shell, then we have 500 kilograms of nut meat. Oil percentages vary, but when I looked back in the day, work was being done to select for higher oil cultivars. Say 40% oil would provide 200 litres of oil per acre and 300 kilos of feed or food, depending upon where this meal ends up. All this is great productivity, and you can run grazing animals under the trees during the year, so even more production. In more arable country, hazelnuts could be grown in spirals to allow tractors to run in and out of the field that still produce grains, if you must, and hazelnuts. But wait, there's more. No, not steak knives. But remember those nutshells I passed over a little while back? They can be used as mulch, if needed, but I think they have an even better use, burning them in a pyrolytic furnace to create two products. 1, biochar, and 2, heat. Let's start with heat. Heat can be used to boil water for dairies or milking parlours and so on. The other main use of heat is the creation of electricity. When we combine this function with the hazelnut oil currently selling at around $100 a litre, food grade, we could power a small family, small farm, and their motor vehicles if diesel and electric were from a few acres of hazelnuts. At $100 a litre, that equates to $15,800 a barrel, equivalent in oil terms, so it may be more economic to convert all vehicles to electric and use the oil for other things. Returning to the marvellous Million Hazelnut campaign, these trees are getting some attention not just from the more enlightened types. The author of this piece, Steve McFadden, spoke with Chris Gamer, a spokesman for the Million Hazelnuts campaign. Quote, Gamer told me he'd recently returned from a conference in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, sponsored by the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, a project affiliated with the University of Wisconsin. He learned a great deal by participating. There's lots of interesting things happening, he said. Big Ag is interested in hazelnuts and they are doing cloning. They are looking to be active. Behind them, you should note, are large investors who are looking at the prospect of dominating the hazelnut industry. Gamer said that the cloning approach to hazelnut trees is a concern for him. Clones have only a limited genetic history of the plant from which they have been cloned and are not adapting in real time. Hazelnuts grown from seed have all the history of that tree and its ancestors through all the genetic lineage back to the beginning, and do also adapt as change is ongoing. So those trees will be more resilient as we face the consequences of climate change. Where I'm at, the scale that I and others are working on, Gamer told me, is to propagate from seeds and from a diversity of growers. We do breeding along the pathways pioneered by Luther Burbank using selective breeding to increase nut size, volume and quantity and quality. End quote. I have some issues with the cloning/seed-raised dichotomy discussed in the quote. We have a couple of hazelnuts on site and I'll be taking cuttings from them this winter, cloning them in effect. What grows here will be replicated. I understand the concern of expanding cloned hazels across great swathes of land. If the million trees were all of the same tree, they would be way open to disease which could wipe out the genetic expression of that particular hazelnut. In the same way the blight hit Ireland's potatoes in the 1840s and 50s, but had little effect in the Andes because of the genetic variation in potatoes in those mountains, and the single or at most 3 varieties in Ireland, cloned hazelnuts could be susceptible to a similar effect. I think a balance between expanding microclimate-adapted cultivars and exploring improved varieties through scientific breeding would make for the best outcome. These things can be sorted. The key problem faced is the annual production of soy and replacing it with a perennial production system. On balance, I'd go with the perennial most times. So a well powered by renewable energy sources with demand balance through pumped hydro batteries, and that same well fed through the use of perennial food production systems would be a world worth living in, and one I think we should all be striving for. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Podcasting checklists for those thinking about kicking off their adventure in podcasting are still available over at John Moore Podcasting Services, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.